Hello and welcome to Working Class Hollywood. Before I start today's show, I just want to say a quick word. My guest today is amazing, and I just want to ask you to share this podcast with someone you think might enjoy it. If you or anyone you know has any interest in writing for television, they are going to want to hear this interview that I'm about to play for you. Matt Nix is an incredible guy. He's had some amazing success creating and running television shows. The advice that he gives is priceless. So if you think there's anyone out there that would benefit from hearing this interview, just send them the link to the podcast or tell them about it at work. Give them a call and suggest that they listen. One, it'll be good for them because they'll get to hear this amazing interview. And two, it'll just help spread the word for this podcast and get it into more people's ears. Also, as always, if you haven't yet, do me a big favor. Please go onto iTunes or Spotify or wherever you're listening. Leave a review. Rate the podcast, subscribe. It is really, really helpful to me and the show. All right, without further ado, let's get it started. Welcome to Working Class Hollywood, conversations with people that make the movies, TV shows, and entertainment you love. If you're looking to break into or move up in the entertainment industry, or you're just a fan of content and want to hear about how it's made, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Jeremiah Smith.
If you can sell and you can bust ass and you suck, you will be a not very good, successful writer. If you are incredibly talented and you can't sell and you don't work very hard, you will be a very talented barista.
I am so excited to bring you today's guest. Matt Nix is a writer, producer, and showrunner for television. He created shows like Burn Notice on USA, The Good Guys on Fox, The Comedians on FX starring Billy Crystal, and most recently, The Gifted, a superhero show set in the X-Men world, also on Fox. Matt has had a really interesting career. He was a screenwriter for 8 years before he transitioned into television when he sold Burn Notice, and since then he has created and ran some really quality, entertaining shows. Matt has some really incredible stories from when he was starting out trying to become a writer. The advice that he gives to people that want to be TV writers is so good. You guys, you are gonna love my conversation with Matt Nix. All right, I am here with Matt Nix. Hi, Matt.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Thank you for doing this.
Of course.
I'm excited to talk to you. So, Matt, I came into contact with because Rashad Raisani, who was one of my guests on the podcast early on, writer, awesome guy. He put me in touch with Matt because Rashad worked for you on Burn Notice. Is that right?
Yes, and we have been working together on The Gifted for the past couple of years as well.
Gotcha. Cool. So, Matt, I always start with the same question. Where are you from, and how'd you end up in Los Angeles?
Well, very originally, I'm actually from Los Angeles.
Okay.
When I was little, I lived here, and then I was, went to grade school in Palm Springs, and then I went to high school and junior high in Northern California, and then I came back to LA to go to UCLA, and are you sort of asking like how did I end up in the industry, or just how did I end up physically
basic
here?
Backstory. I went to UCLA as well. So,
okay, there we go.
Go Bruins.
What was your major?
English literature.
Okay, yeah, that is actually what I wish I had majored in.
Oh,
I did not major in that. I majored in political science. I was a pretty serious student, but I was really into theater, and I would make movies with my friends and stuff like that. But I really imagined I need to do something serious like lawyering or doctoring or something,
a real job.
A real job, something that people approve of, right? But looking back, I realized I kind of went to UCLA because I wanted to continue with the theater and and I was interested in the movie stuff, although I wouldn't have admitted it to myself at the time.
Mm-hmm. Did you do theater at UCLA?
I did, although I found UCLA theater is really about UCLA theater. They don't really want... So I actually got some parts and stuff because they were just like, I guess he's a theater student that we haven't met. And then
right.
They'd be like, who are you? And I was like, I'm a political science student. They'd be like, oh.
Did you ever hear of the a cappella group Awaken a cappella?
No.
Oh.
Was that you?
I was in Awaken a cappella Yes.
There we go. Well,
So-
that's actually the terrible thing about you. I mean, I like the school, but you can go through 4 years, 5 years at UCLA and just never know about something that was, like major to somebody else.
Yeah.
They just know.
It's a massive school.
But yeah, so then I graduated and I was going to go to law school, and my dad took me aside and was basically like, hey, I kind of think you're going to law school because you did well on the LSAT and you don't know what else to do. You've never expressed any interest in law at all. And he's basically said to me, like, I'll support you in going to law school if you can find a single lawyer in the world who is doing anything where you can look me in the eye and say, yeah, I want to spend my life doing that. And I actually tried, and I was like, oh, I can't do that, right? And then my friend Ben,
What a great dad
Oh, it was
dad
fantastic.
sounds like. I mean,
Yeah.
to like encourage you towards like something you're more passionate about. Versus, I feel like a lot of parents, it's the opposite. It's like, people move to LA and they're like, oh, like, what are you going to do out there? Why don't you just go to med school like a real human?
Well, it sort of gets better from there because like so my one of my good friends from college, who I ended up actually years later creating the Comedians with him, Ben Wexler, we'd written together we'd done some stuff for the Daily Bruin, we'd done some humor stuff together, and he just called me like right after I decided not to go to law school and was like, hey, I'm working in the entertainment industry, I'm writing, I need a roommate, I've got an awesome apartment, why don't you move? I was in DC at the time doing an internship. He was like, why don't you move back to LA after you graduate, move in with me, I'll get you a job in the entertainment industry, and basically this is what you can do with your life. And I was like, yes, that is what I am doing with my life.
Wow. I
have decided. So it was basically just because I had this great apartment that I could, and so I moved in with him. I did get the job in the entertainment industry, but then later when I worked as an assistant for about 3 years. And then I decided like, oh, if I'm going to do this, I need to do the fun part. Like I've got to, so I decided it was about that time that I met my now wife. She was very encouraging. And then I decided I was going to, go for it as a screenwriter. Now, the thing about it is my great grandfather was a screenwriter for like silent films. Right.
Oh, wow.
He was nominated for an Academy Award for a film called Sergeant York. And he wrote for Frank Capra and all of these things. Now, he died like long before I was born. His son, my great uncle, who's actually still alive, he's in his 90s, but he had been like a child star, not a child medium star in like the 40s. My great aunt, who my sister and daughter are named after, was the president of the Publicists Guild and had been...
You kind of had it in your blood.
Yeah, she represented like every big star at MGM back in the day. Now, all of them were like either dead or long out of the business. My great aunt was actually still in the business, but she was a publicist, couldn't really do anything for me. That said, they all took me aside. Like the ones who were alive all took me aside after I decided this, and they were like, "We're very excited about this. Screenwriting got us through the Depression. You'll never go hungry if you're a screenwriter. That's we feel much better about this than you becoming a lawyer." And I was like, why didn't you tell me this before?
It's almost like when like you have a friend that's like married to like a woman that you like just is awful and like the whole group of friends hates and like but nobody says anything. So they don't want to be that guy. It's like that was your law career. And then
exactly.
when you divorced, it's like, oh thank God
you
the
didn't
law
do it.
career was such a bitch.
Yeah, so I was very very fortunate. I mean, it wasn't like it was it still took a while, but I was like, they were all very encouraging.
That's awesome. What was your first job that you got?
My first job as a writer or job?
Your first entertainment job?
I got a job. So that guy, Ben Wexler, who he was working casting at the time on Forrest Gump. And so he's talking to talent agents all day. And he had a phone voice. He's got a good phone voice. And this agent was like, "Oh, hey, you're good on the phone. Like, are you looking for a job? Because I need a new assistant." He was like, and weirdly, Ben and I sound very similar. Like, we have sort of similar speaking patterns, similar. And he was like, "I'm not available, but I have someone who sounds just like me." Right. And so the agent was like, "Oh, okay, send him in." Right. And so I went in. It was like right after the Northridge earthquake. So give you a sense for how old I am. And so the the place was like, there were cracks in the walls and they were still like cleaning up after the Northridge earthquake. But I went in and I ended up getting the job. I worked there for about a year and a half. I worked for 2 different agents. And it's funny, like I was sort of miserable at the time because it was a very stressful job. And I was working for 2 agents in the middle of pilot season. And this was like the old days before you could email things to clients and stuff. So like a lot of it was just, delivering scripts and copying sides and, like it was thousands of phone calls a day. And it was incredibly intense and really difficult and not really what I wanted to do with my life. That said, I always tell people, like, even if you have creative aspirations, like working in a job like that is not a bad idea you don't want to do it forever. But at the time I was like, this is useless. What am I doing? Right. But then years later, I'm like, oh, wait a second. No, I know what my agent is thinking because I worked for an agent. I know how this works. Like I know what they're doing. I know how people sound on the phone. I know. And that was where I kind of like learned the language of Hollywood and the rules of Hollywood. And yeah, it's funny. I was talking to somebody the other day about, as an assistant, when you learn in Hollywood, like how to cancel a lunch with somebody, right? And it's
very
like,
important.
Well, yeah, it's like you can't, I mean, and you know the rule, you did it. Like you can't, if you want to cancel lunch with somebody for your boss, right, you can't say, my boss would not like to have lunch with you. And if you want to, but if you want to cancel it forever, like I've asked people this, everybody knows the rule. It's basically like, oh yeah, boss can't do the lunch, but because of travel and circumstances beyond my control, I can't actually like reschedule lunch right now. So I'll call you back to reschedule lunch. And then you just never call back. Right. And so that's how, but if you didn't work in Hollywood, you don't know the rules. And if you're on the other side of that phone call, you might be waiting around for that callback, but not knowing that it's never coming. So that was sort of where I learned that. Then I went to work for a development executive at TNT Original Movies for about a year and a half as well. And so, yeah, I ended up, it seemed like a really long time at the time. I was like, I've been an assistant for 3 years. What am I doing with my life? And then around that time, I left and decided to pursue writing full time.
We were talking before we started recording that, yeah, I started at the agency too. And I couldn't agree more. It's just like, even if you want to, do something in the creative side of things, like you still need that language and that sort of like, just that work ethic and right. Cause I know plenty of people that, talk about wanting to write or direct or whatever. And they just, they do it from somewhere else in the country, or they just like do it kind of like half-assedly or whatever. But, I'm guessing, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but to like succeed in television writing, to do something like you do, it's not just like, sitting in a coffee shop musing about like storylines. Like there's a lot of business that goes on too. There's a lot of just like knowing how to deal with people and interact and hiring and firing and management and this and that and that. So like all those skills are stuff that you can kind of like absorb as an assistant at a talent agency or whatever. Like it's.
Yeah, I'd say though, even before I mean, eventually, yes, you've got to deal with people and you got to, people are making deals and you need to understand, all of those things. But even before that, I found like when I started writing, and I remember when I got my first manager, my first agent, I'd worked for an agent and I knew how agents thought about their clients. I knew what they wanted out of their clients and stuff like that. And I lived in fear of this. I'd seen the client who signs with an agent and is super excited, and they're basically like, and now it's all downhill, right? And you are literally, I saw it like you could literally turn your agent off to you in 2 weeks.
Yeah. Right.
Just you call and you're like, hey, so what's going on? Right. And the agent's like, I'm working. What do you want from me? And I was like, I never wanted to be that client that they didn't want to hear from. I wanted to be and I knew a lot about how to be. So even before I got an agent, I was like, I'm going to write all the things. Right. And like, I'm going to be, I quit my job and I was like, I'm writing full time And, I did some tutoring on the side, but basically I was like writing all the time. But I think I quit in October. I had a film in a film festival in February, right? So I quit, like made the film, got it into a film festival, went in February. So, my girlfriend was like, now my wife was basically like, okay, all right, good. So you're taking this seriously. And then I was like writing scripts and the whole thing. But then when I got that first agent, I think it was like for 2 years, I made it a policy never to call my agent for anything unless I had generated independent good news on my side that my agent didn't know about.
That's interesting, yeah.
Hey, how's it going? 2 things. One, I was wondering if you got a chance to call that executive about that thing that we were talking about, right? Also, I wrote a spec, right? And so my agent was always would always pick up my calls immediately because I always had good news,
yeah.
Right? And then the other thing was my then manager had a thing on his wall of like projects that his clients had, right? And it was a list of projects, and some of his clients were definitely bigger than I was, and I was like, well, I can't compete with their business cloud, right? But I can do this. And I was like, I'm always going to have more projects on my list that I am working on with producers or whatever, even if they're not paying gigs yet, if they're pitches or whatever. I'm always going to have more projects on my list than all of his other clients combined, right? Because again, you can't argue with that, right? And so the big lesson that I got just as a creative from that is, if you are working harder than everybody else, you are gonna you kind of can't argue with that. And it sort of goes along with like a thing that I tell young writers, which is basically like, if you can sell and you can bust ass and you suck, you will be a not very good successful writer, right? But if you are incredibly talented and you can't sell and you don't work very hard, you will be a very talented barista. And so like, you can't control your talent, but you can definitely control like how hard do you work, and the other big thing is just, can you sell?
I love that. What was it hard for you to like make that leap? Like Rashad was talking about, like becoming that schmuck, working at the coffee shop, leaving a job that pays and, probably had benefits and everything. Like, what was that decision like for you to go from the job to just like, I'm just going to focus on this thing that currently pays me no money, but it's what I want to do for money?
It was hard because, as I talking about the college thing, like I was really, I loved approval, you know what I mean? But the best thing that happened to me was I met my girlfriend, now wife. I keep saying that. And she was like, I was working in development as sort of like a step above an assistant, and like a half step above an assistant. And in Hollywood, like I could sort of trade on that a little bit. And she worked in corporate America, right? And she was like, oh, you're a secretary. And I was like, no. I'm a developer. Yeah, this is much more important. She's like, do you answer a phone for another human being and take the phone messages down? I was like, yes. She's like, okay, secretary. So that's what you do. And she saw me, I was in a writing class at the time, and she saw my writing. She's like, you're really good. What are you doing? And I was like, I'm working as a development. And she was like, you're a secretary, quit now. And I was like, I can't do that because this is Hollywood. And she was like, yeah, I don't care. Just quit now. And so it was literally months of like, did you quit today? I was like, no. And she's like, loser, quit, right? And so I did eventually. And then actually the funny thing about that was what led to me quitting was I was at TNT in their original movies department. My boss left to go to UTA to be an agent and invited me to not come with him because I was not a very good assistant at that point because I was pretty bored. And so he left, but I remained behind at TNT. And then his boss left to be president of Miramax for like 10 minutes. and then his boss left to go do something else at another. So basically, in terms of who had been involved in my in the hierarchy, it basically went Ted Turner, nobody, me, right? And so I had a job where I had no duties at all. My duties were show up in the morning and leave at night and eat the vegetables from the vegetable plate and do whatever you want. Because officially I was supposed to be like absorbed into the secretarial pool, but that was in Atlanta. So basically it was a time in corporate America where they could forget that they had an employee.
Wow.
And so I came in for months just collecting a paycheck. I'd be like, hey, anybody want me to do anything? They'd be like, nope. So I started writing while I was there. And then eventually I quit there. And then the big thing was for me, just like that feeling of I'm going to have to go to parties and tell people. And the other thing was like my girlfriend was basically supporting me because she had this corporate job. And that was actually a thing for Rashad as well. Like
you guys have very similar stories.
Yeah. And he, similarly, and this is actually a thing I see over and over and over, particularly with guys. Like if I was to identify one single factor that is the biggest determiner of success for a certain kind of TV writer, it's did you have a supportive spouse? Right?
Oh, that's interesting.
It's basically if you had that, a supportive spouse who could also kind of like carry you through, the some of the hard times. But she was like, I quit, and she was basically just like, I just do your thing. At the same time, I was tutoring. And eventually she took me aside and she was like, let me tell you why you're tutoring. You're tutoring so that when we go to parties, you can tell people that you have a job and I'm not supporting you. But that's bullshit. I am supporting you, okay? Like you are not making enough money tutoring to make any difference in our lifestyle at all, okay? And she looked me square in the eye and she was like, I want you to understand something. I am marrying you for your money. You just don't have it yet. So, like, I want you to spend the money that we have with, just be responsible, but like, don't do it with any guilt because I'm going to spend all of your money when you make it and I'm not going to feel guilty about it. And I was like, that's the deal? She's like, that's the deal. So quit tutoring, right? And write full time because you are wasting my money because your tutoring's never going to go anywhere and your writing is, right? And I was like, okay. And we both kept up our side of the bargain. I did write. I did end up getting jobs, and she spends my money with abandon. I mean, it's her money too.
Yeah. No, she sounds amazing, actually.
Yeah, she was great. And that was really, she was the one who really sat me down and was just like, yeah, you're not, this is your ego. You just don't want to feel like a schmuck. And she was like, you're not a schmuck. You just have to do good work and it'll matter. And the other thing is she said, here's the deal. You're going to write 10 scripts that you can look me in the eye and tell me you are proud of and that deserve to be in the world and that you really believe in. And if you write 10 scripts and you can't, and none of them get any traction and you really, you swing for the fences and nothing happens, then you go to med school or something. But she was like, you can't quit before 10. And yeah, like I still haven't written 10 specs.
So you're still on the hook. Your wife could start like a consulting business for fledgling writers or something, just like kicking people into gear at the early stages of their career. She sounds so good.
She's great. I don't know, over the years, like it's a little bit like being in a blast furnace. Like, it'll either make you or it'll kill you. But yeah, in my case, it was what I needed.
So when did it like click for you? Like when did you actually start getting paid to write?
Well, weirdly, like I started getting kind of non-union gigs pretty quick. Like I ended up the one thing that I did when I had that non-job at Turner Network Television was I met this guy who was over on an exchange program from Ireland, and then he talked his way into a development fund in Ireland and was hiring people to write scripts. And he hired me because I was like the only, he liked my short film and I was the only kind of American screenwriter he knew. And truthfully, it was like a good choice because I would do, I think he hired me for $3,000 for my first script, but it was great discipline for me because I was like, I'm not going to let him down. So I wrote a script that, it never got made, but it got a little bit of traction in a sort of indie way. People liked it and stuff like that. And so, so that actually happened, I don't know, like 6 months after I quit, which was remarkable. I was super lucky, even though it was not a lot of money. It was just like, there was a discipline to, I've been hired to do something and I'm going to turn in something that is, respectable and a huge learning experience. So I would work for him some, and then I also did an adaptation of a British literary novel in that time on spec. I did it was an adaptation of a book called Cock, and it's a very dark sort of, imagine like it was like long before Fight Club, but it was a little Fight Clubby, and it was really dark, and it's all about sort of like sex and addiction and like, basically this woman grows a penis and rapes and kills her husband. It's kind of a comedy, but like a super dark comedy. Anyway, I wrote this thing on spec. It kind of didn't go anywhere, right? The director was going to do something and it kind of disappeared. A year later, right? The producer on that thing that never came together was like, hey, whatever happened to that script, right? And because he'd become a manager, I was having lunch with him and I was like, you don't have it? You were the producer. He's like, well, then give it to me. I send him over the script. He's like, calls me the next day. He's like, I don't know what you did in your rewrite of this script, but it is amazing. And I was like, I didn't touch it for a year. And he's like, well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I'm getting you an agent. I had an agent like 3 days later.
Oh, wow.
Right. And then that script got sent out. And what I discovered was if an executive goes home with a pile of scripts, right? And it's a good lesson for anybody thinking about what to write, right? An executive goes home with a pile of scripts for the weekend, right? And they got to read a bunch of stuff. What script are they going to read first? They're going to read Cock first, right?
Well, some of them are, yes.
Yeah, well, but the truth is like some of them. And
the title grabs you.
Yeah, the title grabs you, right? And then the other thing is like, if they like it, right? Let's say you read that and then you read like a really great romantic comedy called, like When She Met Me. I mean, I'm just making it up, right? Yeah. And then 2 weeks later, someone says, hey, have you read anything interesting that you liked lately? You can't remember the name of When She Met Me.
Right.
Right? But you can sure as shit remember my script, right? And so that script turned out to be this kind of like, everybody read it, right? And it was really memorable. And it was also a sample for everything and nothing, right? Because it was like unlike anything else. So it was like, I don't know, could he be good at a book adaptation? Sure. Like that was a book adaptation. So I did that, right? And so then that led to a ton of meetings. Eventually I got a job doing a book adaptation of this detective novel for Sony, which was arguably the worst job in Hollywood at the time, like the worst official screenwriting job, because it was already a dead project. It was clear no one wanted to do this movie. So they were looking for who is the actual cheapest writer we can possibly hire, right? Because we want to waste as little money as possible on this thing that we all clearly don't want to do. But since it's Hollywood, they can literally be like, we prefer to spend $100,000 on a writer. That is preferable to having an uncomfortable conversation wherein we all admit to ourselves that we went down this road and we don't want to do it anymore, right? And I was like, your loss is my gain. I will take your $100,000 and do this book adaptation. And so it took a while to get, because they were sort of trying to they were like, oh, maybe something, And anyway, I got the job. The movie was effectively in turnaround before I could finish the script.
Yeah.
But it got me in the guild. It was like, that was my first kind of like paid job type job. And then in the way of such things, like okay, now you've got this job and you've got this window of time where, maybe you've got a big movie at Sony, you know what I mean? And then that's when you go out and try to sell more things.
Right.
Because, everybody's like, well, he's got this job at Sony. Like, it could be the biggest thing in the world, right? We should snap him up. So in that time period, I sold a pitch. And then basically like
a feature pitch or a
feature
TV
pitch.
pitch?
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically for about 8 years, I was like just job to job to job to job to job, rewrites. It was a time when there were a lot more rewrites in Hollywood. So it'd be rewrites or pitches or adaptations or whatever. And I was just voracious. I would like anything. I would just my answer was always yes, kind of to a fault. Like, because I would write, I wrote some things, movies I'd never go see, you know what I mean? Like, but it's like, yeah, I'll figure out your movie for you. Yeah, sure, no problem. I'll do that. And I was like, my attitude was, I will write everything. I will write all of the jobs, right? And some of them will be things that I love, and some of them will not be things that I love, but anything, and I will bust ass for every single job. It was one time that I went in for a meeting, and it was, they brought up this movie about a special school for kids who have superpowers, where the superpowers are regarded as deficits. Like, so basically it's like, you can fly, so we need to fix that, right? Mm-hmm. And I had literally heard that same idea, like, and pursued that same idea at other companies, I think 2 or 3 times. So I went into them and I was like, they pitched this thing and I was like, oh, so are you running into this problem in the second act? And they were like, what? Yes, we are. And I was like, yeah, okay. And this, you probably have a character kind of like this. And does he do something like this, or she? Do they do something like this and then that doesn't work? And they were like, have you read this? And I was like, no, just go with me, right? And I ended up, they wanted to hire me in this meeting for a script, to rewrite a script I had not read, because I had pitched on so many things and gone after so many jobs. I knew what their script was about just from the subject, right? And I knew like the second act break, right?
That's funny.
And so that was basically my career for like 8 years. And then my agent called me up and was like, dude, you're doing television now. And I was like, don't they want television people to do that? And he's like, yeah, that changed. Like they like feature guys now. And I was like, okay. He's like, come up with a TV show. I'll talk to you later. And I was like, okay. And I ended up coming up with a TV show, and that was Burn Notice, and it was on for 7 years. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So during your 8 years as a screenwriter, were any of the films that you wrote or wrote on, like, released, ones that people would know, or was it a lot of stuff that, because I know there's a ton of scripts that are circulating through the studio system and falling in and out of production and this and that?
Yeah, the falling out of production part, that was me. Yeah, no, there were a couple of things that I worked on, one that got made and another that is getting made, neither of which had my name on them. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, like, I would not recommend, the screenwriting career that I had at the time is now not to be had. Like, it doesn't exist anymore. There was a sort of, at that time, there was a kind of a career called like journeyman screenwriter, and it pays pretty well.
Yeah,
you know
yeah.
what I mean? Like, you're just sort of going from job to job. The problem basically is that, as in the case of that first job that I got, like, if they're not in the movie world, right? If they are spending, less than $1 million on writers, right? They're not serious about the movie, right? So if you're in the business of, rewriting something for low 6 figures, you're making $250,000, which is really good money.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll take it. But if you're making $250,000 to rewrite a script for somebody, and it's hard to get your head around this, but that means they're not serious, right?
That might sound crazy to, people that don't work in the movie industry.
But it's basically like, I remember one time there was a movie that I did that almost got made, where I had taken and so part of it was like I would get a lot of these jobs that had been kind of, like perma development projects, like they'd just been sitting on desks in a studio for years, right? And they had too much money against them for them to feel comfortable just writing it off and throwing the thing in the garbage. But so they're sort of like, well, is there any chance we could do anything with this that would mean that we wouldn't have to just write off all of the money we've spent on this project? And so at that point, they're like, okay, bring in the newish guys with original ideas, right? And then hoping that one of them can, and I say guys, I mean, women and men, hoping that one of them can do something with one of their perma development projects that puts it back onto the front burner. But a typical experience that I had was, so I did a movie at a studio. It had been kicking around for a really long time. I came in, I pitched on it. They loved my idea. I did this rewrite. They loved the rewrite, right? I had a second rewrite step in my deal. I did that second rewrite step. I turned it in, right? And I talked to the executives, and they were like, you crushed it. What an amazing job. This is fantastic. And I was like, great. So I just want to, do a couple more tweaks before we turn it in. They were like, we don't think it needs it. We should just turn it in the studio right now. And I was like, yeah, but I mean, like, I should fix this and this. And, so I was showing it to you guys, and they were like, no, let's just turn it in. I was like, well, let me just fix the typos. And they were like, okay, but don't take too long because it's fantastic the way it is. And I was like, okay. And I talked to my wife, and she was like, so what did they think? And I was like, well, they said they loved it. They said I crushed it. I'm pretty sure I'm getting fired. And she was like, well, what do you mean? And she was like, they said they didn't want any rewrites. And there's no such thing as a producer that doesn't want rewrites.
Right.
Right. So something's wrong. And I called my then agent, and she's like, you're insane. They called me to tell me how amazing the job you did was and that they think you're a genius. You are insane. 1 week later, she's like, I have bad news. It turned out that it's not that they didn't think that I'd done a good job. They did, right? I had been fired. They had actually already decided to fire me off of the first draft, right? Because they were like, this is really good now, right? This is something that we can get some momentum on. And the way you get momentum in Hollywood is by spending money. And the fact is, I was not a big enough writer at the time for anyone to get any momentum, right? And what they needed was to go to the studio and say, all right, you need to spend $1.5 million on this so that we can get it ready for production, right? And the way the Hollywood machine is set up, they just didn't, like, it wouldn't make sense to anybody. Okay, we spent like $200,000 on this, and now we're gonna make it. That's not possible.
That all sounds so insane, though, because it's like, if you have a good script and it's working and everyone's happy with it, like, why,
that's not. But they call it getting the studio pregnant, right? Mm-hmm. And that's basically as a political matter, right? They need people to feel like investment in the project. They need people to feel like it's moving forward. They need people to feel like, something big is happening. And in that case, they eventually were like, you did a great job. I mean, they called to apologize because basically they'd already hired the other writers.
Right.
Right.
That's why expensive writers they would make people want to make the movie.
Exactly. And they didn't want to, they felt bad about it. They didn't want me to do any more work because I'd already been replaced. Right. Wow. And so they were basically like, you did such a great job. It's good news. Now we can hire these incredibly hot writers it was a writing team. Now we can hire these incredibly hot writers to, put this over the top and get it made. You should be happy. And it's like, it's weird. I'm not happy.
Yeah, that is weird. It's kind of a backhanded compliment in a way. I want to get into your TV career. Obviously, you've had a lot of success in TV. But one thing you said that I want to touch on. So you said that, for those 8 years, you said yes to everything. You wrote all the things, even a lot of stuff that necessarily didn't appeal to your creative instincts and what you would watch or whatever. Do you think that's important as a starting out writer? Or, because some would maybe say it's like, oh, well, I have creative integrity. Like I would never write an animated film, or I would never, do something that was too lowbrow because that's not my taste or whatever. Or do you think that creative integrity is something that you kind of have to earn in a way? Like if you want to be a writer, just say yes to everything like you do, or should you be more selective?
I should say I don't do that now. I mean, I guess
right now you've earned it, but at the time, as you're like trying to get started.
But I should say, like, to be fair, like I still have those instincts. Like part of it is like I just like learning about new. I'm excited about that, So to some extent, and I like the puzzle of it. I like so that part of me, there certainly is a part of me that's like, okay, well, this is what I want to say, and but there's also just like, I don't know, is it possible to write a horror film where the bad guy's an octopus? Let's see. I don't know, maybe it is. And the harder it is, the more I'm like, I don't know, I bet I could do it. Let me see But the thing that I talk about with, when people will ask me for advice as writers and stuff is like if you look at any other creative discipline, right? You look at people training. My son's at the LA County High School for the Arts, right? So you look at the training there, okay? As an actor, right, are you generally asked to originate roles in original productions, right, as a starting out actor? No. You're doing Shakespeare. You're doing things that people have done before where there's an established, we understand how to do this. That's your training. You're doing what people have done for a long time. You're getting a sense for like how this works. And then you're going to find your way to your own acting style, whatever that is, right? In painting, like I take painting and drawing lessons, right? When you're starting out in school, they're like, okay, now you are going to learn how to paint like an impressionist, right? And you do reproductions of masterworks.
Yeah.
Right? And there's an established thing. It's like, now you paint your version of this masterwork. Now you paint your own thing in the style of this masterwork. Now you do, and there's a process and there's an apprenticeship phase and obviously music, right? People don't start out, you don't learn piano composing, right?
Right.
That's not how it works. Like you learn physically how to play the piano, then you play all the greats, and then having done that, and so my attitude about that how you learn is, I've always wanted to start like basically the non-nurturing film school where like, what's your first assignment as a screenwriter? Write a movie about two buddy cops and one is about to retire. And, I will give you the most hackneyed premise in the world, something that's been done a million times because you think it's so easy, right? You think that that's so done and blah, 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 that you're above that. No, you should be so lucky as to write that hackneyed premise. And the truth is, if you engage with it and you really try to do it, you will learn just how hard it is, and you will learn just how much creativity you need to bring to all of that. And that kind of thing is really valuable in the sort of figuring out how to do it, right? Now, that said, you can go too far with that, right? But the same thing could be said of painting. Like you could, I don't know, you reproduce masterworks and then you never graduate from reproducing masterworks and you end up just being a guy who sells art in a mall, reproductions of, and you never find your voice. So it's not that you couldn't do that to a fault. And to some extent, like I would say that I probably did that too long in features, right? That said, it really helped me when I went to television, right? Because television is just problems, right? It's just like, you're in production and people are constantly firing at, like, okay, we need to do this and everything changed because we can't get the location, and you need to write very fast. You need to solve problems very fast, and you need to figure out the puzzle of television is huge. And so like, my thing is always like, yeah, so you've got this creative voice and you've got this thing that you want to do, and you have this thing that you want to express, and it can only be expressed as a television show with no commercials that is 71 minutes long, right? Well, guess what, man? Like, you're not a television writer.
Yeah.
You don't get to do that, right? And so that for me, that training turned out to be very good for me for when I went into television, because like, obviously there is a sort of, Burn Notice was a great example of like, it's very much my voice. It's what I wanted to do. I was super excited to do it. And the turning point in that project was, I set it in Newark originally, and they were like, we think it should be in Miami. And I was like, no, artistically, I really think it needs to be in Newark. And they were like, we really think it needs to be in Miami. And I was like, you need to understand, for me as an artist, like, this is a passion project for me, and it needs to be in Newark because this is how the character works. And they were like, it's in Miami. And I was like, yes, it's in Miami. Let me just do that for you. And I was kind of pissed off when I sat down to move it to Miami. But the truth is, like, I had 8 years of experience of like, yes, sir, let's figure this out, sir. And I was like 20 minutes into rewriting it in Miami, and I was like, oh, this is actually better.
Miami is a little sexier than Newark.
Absolutely.
No offense to anyone from Newark.
Yeah.
So was Burn Notice the first TV pitch that you, like, were you like one for one in your TV career?
Well, I did two simultaneously. So Burn Notice I sold. Like, I literally was like, I went in, I did it, and they called me, and they were like, you sold it. And I was like, great, what does that mean? They're like, well, now you pitch it to networks. I was like, okay. And it wasn't, I don't want to exaggerate. It wasn't like that easy in the sense that like it was kind of a low priority project for them, but kind of because it was sort of low priority and because it was my first thing, I was sort of flying under the radar. The other big thing with that was I had done in the feature world, I had been the guy who, and I carried this to this day, in the feature world, the way to keep on a project is just these massive rewrites, right? Like, if you're just tweaking at the edges, you're never like, basically you're going to get fired, right? But I realized in the feature world, I could always get a new lease on life by just, oh, you didn't like it? Here's a new thing, right? And they'd be like, oh, wow, there's a new script, and you could get this new lease on life, and you could, I could pay for my house that way. When I went into TV, I realized nobody's doing that here. So the development process for Burn Notice was really long, but they would say it's in Miami now, right? And I just massively rewrote it and handed them a whole new script, and they were like, oh, wow, he did it, right? Mm-hmm. Which there's not a lot of that in TV because most people didn't kind of come up this other route. They come up the route of like, yeah, you do a pilot this year and then it doesn't go, and then you do a pilot the next year or whatever. And I was like, no, I have to do this.
Right.
They have given me notes. I must do all of them. So
someone else might have just word searched Newark and just replace all Miami and just like, there you go. Now it's in Miami.
Yeah. And I massively redid it. And then I ended up having like, I think it was like 4 completely different A stories in the pilot of Burn Notice, and I kept just doing it and doing it and doing it. And about a year later, like kind of 10 Little Indian style, like mine was the thing that was left, and so they made it.
And when you started on Burn Notice, were you immediately hired as the showrunner, or did they pair you with someone that was like, a veteran showrunner that knew how to put a TV show together?
I got really lucky. It happens much more commonly now, but basically I did the pilot, right? And I had actually been writing and directing short films like on a regular basis, so I knew something about production and that kind of thing. And when I was producing the pilot, when we were doing the pilot, the idea had always been that I would get a showrunner, right? But then I was doing the pilot. Pilot had budget problems. They were basically going to, we were about $250,000 over budget. They were going to cut $250,000 from the budget by cutting all of the action in Burn Notice, which it was an action show.
Like, it's a big part of it.
But it would have been disastrous. And so I was sort of trying to get, at the time, I was just like Skippy the writer. You know what I mean? Like, they were not going to include me in any of these conversations. And I kept riding around in the scouting van trying to solve the problem. And I'd be like, okay, but I could cut this scene. And they were basically like, yeah, that's not going to help. You know what I mean? Because basically we've got to be at that location anyway. And I didn't really understand like all of the dynamics of TV production. And ended up sitting down with a second AD, and I was like, tell me how this works, right? And I just wanted to buy myself a seat at the table. I wanted to find a substantial cut to the budget so that I would be included in the meeting when they were like cutting my script to ribbons, right? I just wanted to be there. And so I went back to the Shore Club in Miami to do this rewrite, and I figured out how to cut a location, right? And so I did this rewrite, and I went in the next day, and I was talking to the producers and stuff, and I was like, hey, so I cut this, and they were like, dude, it's thank you, but really, like, we know what we're doing, and that's not going to help. And I was like, please just hear me out, right? And I was like, I cut this scene, I cut this scene, I cut this scene, so we don't have to go to this location, which I knew was $50,000. I was like, I'm going to cut $50,000 from the budget, and then they will know that I should be in on this conversation where they figure out how to cut the rest of the $250,000. And I pitched this to them, and they were like, wait, what? You cut that whole location? I was like, yeah. And they were like, so you cut that day? And I was like, uh-huh. And I wasn't sure, but I was like, yeah. And they were like, so you cut $250,000 from the budget? I was like, yes. Yes, I did. And so that actually turned into, and to their credit, they basically called the studio and they were like, yeah, so Matt figured it out. He rewrote the script and he cut it and he got it to budget. And so they were all set to get on a plane and come out, and they didn't get on the plane. And so going into the to the production of the show, they were like, okay, well, he did, like, that's a big part of, from their perspective, that's what they want a showrunner for. They, they want a showrunner to do exactly what I just did, right? And they had also liked, and like, can he run a room? Well, as part of the run up to doing it, I had actually gotten together like all of the TV writers I knew, my friend Alfredo Barrios and a couple of writers that he had worked with, who are both showrunners themselves now. And we all, Jason Tracy and Craig O'Neill, and so we all got together in a room in like a cafe in Pasadena and broke 2 other episodes. And we wrote those episodes, turned them in, and so they liked those episodes. And so they were basically like, well, he can do the production rewrites, and he like ran a writer's room with other writers, and we liked the scripts. And so, and then the third thing was I was actually interviewing people to be the showrunner, you know what I mean? And I think that they realized at a certain point that, it was a cable show on USA. John Wells is not signing on to be your showrunner. It's going to be like it's going to be some person that is solid and good and et cetera, but it's not going to be, there's no showrunner's going to take that job that is just like the huge hot showrunner. And so at a certain point, they were just like, well, we kind of think maybe we should try it with Matt. And, so they hired somebody, we hired somebody who had experience on shows as my number 2. And he very graciously, we were a few episodes in and he was like, you're fine. So he stuck around for the year, but he was basically like, yeah, you've got this. And it worked out for them. Like I was by far the cheapest showrunner in Hollywood because my deal had been made for me just being a writer. Right. And so yeah, it kind of worked out. It kind of through a series of lucky events and because they kind of felt like they couldn't do better.
Yeah.
So I'll take it.
And so Burn Notice started in what year? 2010?
No, 2007.
Yeah. So since then, that's been kind of like your
main
gig,
years.
like the show running. Like obviously, Burn Notice was 7 years, and then I did a Matt Nix sampling over the last week. So I watched several episodes of The Gifted. I watched the Burn Notice pilot. I watched The Comedians, which I'm actually really excited to talk to you about because I kind of fell in love with that show. But that's been your thing for the last since 2007, right?
Yeah. So basically, it's just been. I mean, I've dabbled in features over the years, but it's kind of like, I've done a few feature scripts. It's a little hard in the feature world. Like the writer is really, the bitch, and it's hard from going from being a writer producer who's in charge of something to just being like kind of a gun for hire in the feature world. So I've done it a few times, but every time I do it, I'm like, why am I doing this again?
Yeah.
And the one thing I will say is like the lifestyle of a feature writer is way better. Like,
Sure.
You just, when I was writing features, I was cooking dinner every night and I was hanging out with my kids, then you're in a really intense year of production and, you're like, hi family. I love you guys so much. Bye. And then, but yeah, I've been basically doing that since 2007.
Awesome. So how did the Comedians come about? Because it's looking at those two shows without knowing you or, the history or whatever, I would never guess that like those shows came from the same person.
The truth is actually like, the reason is, essentially that they didn't. The Comedians was, the guy that called me and was like, "Hey, come."
Your original roommate,
my original roommate, a friend of mine from college. He basically, it sort of came together that he and I were put together with Billy Crystal and Larry Charles to adapt a Danish format, right? And that was what became then Josh Gad got hired, and that was what became the Comedians. And so for me, I'd say my big contribution to like that was really more Ben's show.
Gotcha.
Right?
Were you running that show?
We were officially kind of co-showrunners.
Okay.
I was simultaneously doing Complications, not for the entire time, but for a portion of that time. The big thing that it was interesting was the first time I'd been in a comedy writer's room. The big thing that I ended up doing on that show was plotting, right? And if you look at that show, it's a plottier kind of half hour in the sense that, it tended to be built around something, some sort of clever, like, doubling back or, they're trying to do something.
It's very like
and then,
Curb
a
or
little
Seinfeld
curvish,
or,
exactly.
that where there's always a callback at the end. And
So that really, it was really, Ben was taking the lead on the show running of that show. It just turned out that in the writer's room, as a drama writer, I just had a bigger, I was the plot guy, right? Because that's like what I had experience doing, because in a drama writer's room, you're breaking story. And in a comedy writer's room, you're pitching jokes and talking about lunch. And the interesting thing about a comedy writer's room is I mean, you like room bits, like the sort of comedy of the writer's room. Like a drama room has room bits as well, right? But the level of room bits on a comedy, it's beyond. It's just like that's the main job. It's kind of cracking each other up is the main job. And so yeah, it was a really fun experience. Although, I would sort of pitch jokes and things, but my main job was just like, I would like write down plots on a yellow legal pad. And then I'd be like, hey, what about this? Hey, what about this? And they would all look at me like, this is black magic. Like, what do you do? How does this work? Like, you just write plots down? Like, what is that?
That's funny. Why didn't that show come back, do you think? Because it was only one season, right?
I mean, honestly, the people that loved it really loved it. The audience was never very large. I think that the real issue, I was like, I think we might be in trouble when my dad, who really liked the show, showed it to a friend of his who was a big fan of Billy Crystal's, right? And my dad's, in his 70s, right? And so his friend was in his 70s and is big Billy Crystal fan.
Yeah.
And he watched it and was basically like, I don't know what this is. What is Billy Crystal doing? I don't like Billy Crystal in this show. Right. And I think the calculation that we were doing was basically like, there's the sort of discomfort comedy, right? which is, sort of Curb and, The Comeback and all of those shows, which is a fairly sophisticated and rarefied form of comedy. It's like comedy. It's comedy for people who are super into comedy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because there's no laugh track. There's nothing indicated. They don't look like they're having fun. Right. That's a very specific style of comedy. Right. Borat, Larry Charles was directing, right? So you get like all of their Larry Charles things, right? So over here you've got the group of people that really like the comedy of a certain kind of style of comedy, of discomfort comedy, right? And over here you've got the people who were big fans of Billy Crystal, right? Mm-hmm. And we imagined if you add those two groups together, you've got a massive audience, right? Not realizing that what you really needed to do was figure out what's the overlap between those two audiences. And the overlap is not large.
Yeah.
Right? Now, who's in that overlap is, I would call them like comedy omnivores, right? Basically, people who like comedy, but are not kind of like, they don't need to be all about the most recent hip underground comedian or whatever. So basically they like Billy Crystal. He's a comedy icon. He's been the man for a lot of years. They don't need to be in an underground club to like somebody, so they can like Billy Crystal because he's a big guy. And they also like this other thing, right? And it turned out that the number of people in that category is, in the low hundreds of thousands.
Well, I wish I would have discovered the show sooner, because I really like it. And the other thing the show does that I'm always a big fan of, but I have to imagine doesn't play well to like a broader audience, is like making fun of comedy for comedy, where like those interstitials, like the sketches that they're doing on the show that the show's about, those are not like, a lot of them are like hacky sketches or hacky jokes, but it's like done in this sort of like tongue-in-cheek way. Like, I really appreciate that.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. Like the kind of double backflip mental math that you need to do to really get your head around, like, what is that? I mean, basically, so essentially, when you looked at reviews of that show, they were basically like, this is brilliant. This perfect show is amazing. And then there was a whole other group that was like, this is the worst thing ever made. Right. And it sort of has to do with like, how do you relate? So the way that Josh and Billy were acting, right? Like their attitudes about themselves as performers, right? Are you looking at it and going like, oh, that's Billy Crystal playing Billy Crystal as a little bit of a douchebag in this, in a particular scene? Or do you look at it and go, Billy Crystal's a douchebag because of this, you know what I mean? And obviously Billy's a sophisticated comedian. He's doing a really sophisticated thing, which is stepping back from his own persona, thinking, okay, if I were blind to myself in this particular way, how would that play in this scene? And it's a really sophisticated form of comedy, but some people are just looking at it like, well, it's a documentary style.
Right.
That must be how Billy Crystal really is, and they don't want that.
Yeah.
So it's
basically, it was too smart for people. Matt, just exactly. Boil it down. People are too dumb to like that show.
No, but it is actually, it's a funny thing. Like it's that show, and it happens to me all the time now, where I'll watch shows, and some of my favorite shows are were not successful, right? They just, they go for there's one of my favorite shows of all time is the show Review, right? Which is actually Andy Secunda, his old comedy partner, Andy Daly, was, created the show called Review. It's staggeringly good, right? Yeah. I love it beyond all reason. And nobody's heard of it. I mean, if I made that show, I'd be like, well, put it on my tombstone. I just crushed it.
Right.
And yet it went essentially 2 seasons. They did a very, very short 3rd season. But that's the thing these days where it's just like, okay, so now the people always talk about the upside of, this golden age of television and everything. And it does mean that you're going to have these shows that are like right in the sweet spot for a particular kind of person. But the people don't talk much about the downside of that is you may discover that you have made a show that is right in the sweet spot for, you've made someone's favorite show, right? Or you've made a bunch of people's favorite show. It just happens that you've made, what if you made 275,000 people's favorite show of all time? You have a colossal failure on your hands, right? And yet, how many of us in our lifetimes will do something that 275,000 people love?
Yeah.
It's just a weird time.
And at the end of the day, it's like a business. So if the network can't sell, Pantene Pro V commercials against your work, doesn't make sense for them. So.
Yeah, it's not their fault. Actually FX on in the case of the comedians they were like, at the time, I remember, we all love the show and everybody kind of felt like this can't lose, right? And then it was like, oh, it actually can lose. And it did. So there you go.
So can you talk to me just very quickly about The Gifted, which is that's your most current project, right? Season 2 is airing or is about to finish airing?
We got 2 more episodes.
2 more episodes. So, how did you end up on that show? Are you the creator of that show?
Creator of that show, yeah. Basically, Fox had wanted to do a show set in the X-Men universe for a while, and then they took a run at it, and before me, and then they came to me and they were like, "Hey, what would you do with this?" And the thing about it is, like, the way it needed to fit in with the movies and stuff like that, there were some fairly exacting specifications, and actually kind of similar to our earlier conversation. I think it really helped for me to be the guy who was like, okay, so what are the rules here? Like, all right, so we can't say, we can't talk about Magneto, but we can have Magneto's daughter on the show. So, all right, how can we figure that out, right? So that was, and there was also like a lot of kind of, you got to negotiate Marvel, you got to negotiate Fox, you got to negotiate the Donner Company, which is, the producers of it, all of these things. All smart people, but kind of with different agendas and things like that. And so I came on and pitched them a version of it that could kind of like thread the needle, if that makes sense. And I've always been a fan of the X-Men, and I was excited to do it. And so, yeah, that was basically how that project came together. And it was a while, like, basically, because they knew they wanted to do it, but since they had taken a run at it and it hadn't worked out, they kind of wanted to take a little bit of their time. So, of course, we spent like a year working on it only to get the pickup and then have like 10 seconds to make the pilot and then 10 seconds to make the show, because that's how network television is.
Yeah. Well, it's really good.
Thank you.
If anything I've learned leading up to this interview is that I'm a big Matt Nix fan now, because honestly, I hadn't watched any of the shows that you worked on, and I watched now most of them, and like everyone, I'm like, yes, this is a show that I will now be watching.
Thank
you. Just so if you Google your name, at this current time, it's February 14th, Happy Valentine's Day, man.
Thank you very much.
Everything, all the news articles that are like, season 3 of The Gifted, season 3 of The Gifted. And I read one of those articles where you were talking about the potential of it, maybe not coming back on Fox, but coming into ending up on a streaming service. And this is not the Hollywood Reporter, so I'm not like trying to like, get any breaking news about that. But I am curious about your thoughts in general about sort of the proliferation of all these different platforms for shows to air on. And, I've heard people say this is a great thing for our industry. People say this is like the ultimate demise of our industry. Kind of where do you see this all going as like a content creator?
Well, I think it's clearly not the demise. I think it's really just like the the one thing is just I think people don't really acknowledge a lot. Like, they're different forms. We keep talking about like, streaming shows as if a streaming show and a broadcast network show are just two different ways of doing the same thing, right? But the fact is, like Stranger Things, it's not meant to be watched like week by week by week, right? In fact, if you watched a Stranger Things episode one day a week for, however many weeks, 10 weeks or whatever, you're probably losing the thread a little bit. Like, it's really meant to, and they don't have act breaks, right? They don't have commercials. And their hour is an actual hour rather than a broadcast hour, which is 42 minutes, right? So those are two very different things, right? And then the other divide, I think, right now is between what I call kind of like one eyeball television and two eyeball television.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm of the one eyeball television world.
Oh, you are? Okay.
What
you work on.
So
absolutely.
like, I think reality TV, a lot of I'm guessing, I'm guessing what you mean. So you put it on maybe while you're cooking, or you're like folding laundry, and then you like, pour some wine and watch and talk shit for a minute, but you're not like, turn out all the lights in the house.
Exactly.
The kids are asleep. Turn it up as loud as you can and just like watch this show. Like that would be more like a Stranger Things.
Yeah, like a good friend of mine, Patrick Somerville, created Maniac. Good luck watching Maniac while you're cooking. Do you know what I mean? Like, you need to watch the show with both eyeballs. And so that's really like more like a movie. And so I think that one of the things that's going to sort out over time is just, what is broadcast? Because I don't think broadcast is like going away right as soon as people think it is. There is still a market for that kind of television, but I think the big question is going to be like, what kind of story are you telling, right? Because if you're doing Chicago Fire, right, like Chicago Fire doesn't belong on a streaming service, right? People are not like sitting down. I mean, some people, huge Chicago Fire fans, might sit down and binge watch 12 episodes of Chicago Fire in a weekend, but by and large, that is not what they are doing, right? You want that kind of like come back in, check with the characters, etc. If you are folding laundry, then Chicago Fire will catch you back up. You're fine, etc. And I'm not disparaging Chicago Fire at all. I'm just saying like that's their sweet spot on a broadcast television network. And then the streamers are kind of doing a different thing. And I think one of the things that we're sorting out now is like, what are these different forms, right? And how is this, how are these things going to work? Because like what you do, I mean, my sense is it would be weird to say, I'm going to sit down and stream, and sit down and binge watch the first season of Vanderpump Rules, like having never watched the show. I'm gonna do it right now, and I'm gonna watch it all in a weekend, because it's not really meant to be consumed that way. You know what I mean? It's sort of check in with my friends and see how these people are doing, like kind of on a regular basis, and that's So I guess like that's, and I think as storytellers, one of the things that we kind of all have to get, or we're going to have to get our heads around, is once upon a time you come up with an idea and you're like, is this a TV show or is this a movie, right? And now we're going to have to get our heads around, is this a movie, a big movie? Is this a small movie? Is this a streaming show? Is this an HBO show? Is this a like sort of prestige pay cable show? And that's and what the story is ultimately, I think, is going to drive what the outlet is for the content, and that's the big unanswered question. And then also the other thing that we're all going to have to sort out is what audience actually sustains each of these kinds of entertainment. Because, the other challenge for all of, when we're thinking about things, and all of us now, is like, what are we supposed to do with Westworld, right? Lisa Joy, Jonah, they're friends of mine, but like, that's just a thing. That's basically the equivalent of a giant blockbuster movie on television, right? And again, that's a whole different form as well. Like, they're spending more on effects in a single episode than The Gifted, a superhero show, spends in an entire season.
Yeah.
Right? Game of Thrones, same way. One shot of a dragon on Game of Thrones costs more than everything we do in a single Gifted episode. One shot, right? So like that. So the idea that we like, and this is not about awards, but like in the Emmys, they're basically like, let's look at all the TV shows, right? Well, those are two different things.
Yeah, TV is becoming a broader category that may ultimately need to be sort of like divided into
different things. And you figure out like what is so like, Game of Thrones is made for a global audience, right? And that's one thing. And then, Rectify is a very different kind of thing, that's made for a small domestic audience that, and basically that's kind of supporting the existence of a channel on a basic cable package. And those are two completely different business models. And yet we call those two things the same category of thing. Right. And it's not.
No, that's a smart way of looking at it all. So the last thing I love to get from everybody is just, and you've given a lot already, but just if someone's listening and they are a aspiring writer, a young writer, what's like, I want to write TV shows for my living. What's the best advice you can give them? How do I just go about doing that?
I mean, really, I think when I talk to people about what they're doing, right? Like young writers or whatever, generally speaking, I can tell the difference between people who are going to make it and people who are not going to make it based on sort of volume of work and enthusiasm, right? So when I'm talking to a young writer who I know is going to make it, right? And I say, hey, what are you doing? They're like, okay, well, I'm doing this thing where it's like this weird thing with my friends where there's like that we do scenes and you write the scene and then it goes up and like, and it's not for money, but it's at 1:00 in the morning every Saturday at this theater in North Hollywood. And I'm like, okay, this is someone who loves writing and is taking every opportunity, is seeking out opportunities, is making connections, and is just finding opportunities to put their work in front of an audience. And they're not focused. They're not doing it for another. You don't do that little North Hollywood theater thing because it's like glamorous or you're going to make money at it or what. You do it because you just really want to write stuff and make it and put it in front of an audience, right? And that was like me. I did everything. Like I was so excited to like write a thing for, write a showcase scene for my actor friends just because they're going to say the words, And I still do that stuff. Like today, like I end up writing stuff for free for people all the time just because I'm like, say the words, right? And so that's one thing is basically like, don't like do everything, do all the things all the time. And then the other thing is volume. You know what I mean? Just like I've said this to many people. It's like, okay, you want to be a TV writer and you're telling me you wrote one spec in a year? Mm-hmm. Good luck, man. Because if you come work for me, I want you to write a script in 4 days. I'm not joking. Break it, write it, turn it in. It's good. 4 days. Yeah. Right? So like, my other advice to people is basically like take whatever you're doing, right? And don't double your output. Don't quadruple your output 10 times, right? And if you can get out of that mindset of being precious and like, okay, I need to do this thing and I just want to get it right and it's a couple drafts away, blah blah. No. Like get it done now. Do all the things. Write 7 scripts. Like blow me away, right? Because that's the bar, right? When if you're playing pro ball, like it doesn't matter if you can craft the greatest pilot script ever, you know what I mean, over the course of 2 years and get that job. if that's your writing process, you're in the wrong business.
Right.
Like you shouldn't be doing that. Right. So just, up that output through the roof, challenge yourself to write faster, write better, grind it out, and just try to hit those walls, as many walls as possible, as fast as possible. And the other thing is that, rejection is way easier to handle if you banged something out in 2 weeks and then you show it to your friend. He's like, dude, it's horseshit. Great. Okay.
On to the next.
I'm gonna give myself another week to rewrite this, and like you're gonna get through 6 drafts in 2 months. Great. Like that's somebody that if you've got that muscle, I need you.
Yeah.
Right. But the people who are precious about it, or they've got to take a lot of time, or they're really into their process, or what, just get out there, put it in front of people, and do 10 times as much work as you're doing.
That's awesome. All right. I'm going to wrap it up now. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
No, I really appreciate it. You are awesome and fun, and I love your TV shows, and I'm going to keep watching them. So
thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks.
All right. After that, it is official. I am a big Matt Nix fan, and I hope you are too. You guys, thank you so much for listening. I'm having a blast doing these interviews and putting this podcast together. If you haven't yet already, please do me a big favor. Help me out. Go on to iTunes or Spotify or wherever you're listening and subscribe, rate it, leave a review. It is really helpful to the podcast. If you want to reach me, you can send me an email. I'm at show, SHOW, at workingclasshollywood.com, or you can find me on Instagram. It's Working Class Hollywood. I've got some great interviews coming up in the next few weeks. Stay tuned, keep listening, and I will see you next time.